Good morning, members. You've had several meetings already, I'm sure, this morning. I have, anyway. So this is the meeting of the panel on public service. This should be the last meeting of the session. Okay. Item 1 on the agenda, confirmation of minutes. Can I refer members to the minutes of the meeting held on the 15th of May 2017, LC paper number CB bracket 41382/16 to 17. Before the meeting, we have not received any proposals for amendments. Members, do you wish to propose any amendments now? No. Then can we confirm the minutes? Any objection? No. Thank you. Minutes are confirmed. Item 2 on the agenda. Information papers issued since the last meeting on the 19th of June to 2. 1. CB bracket 4 1373 bracket 16 to 17 bracket 01. Administration's response to the letter or to the issue raised by Mrs. Regina at the last meeting concerning the shortage of manpower in the Occupational Safety Officer grade of the Labour Department. The other paper is paper number CB bracket 41400/16 to 17 bracket 01. Administration's information paper on the duties and manpower situation of the Occupational Safety Officer grade of the Labour Department. The Civil Service Bureau has, in response to the issue raised by Mrs. Regina concerning the shortage of manpower in the Occupational Safety Officer grade of the Labour Department. And the Labour Department and the Labour and Welfare Bureau has also supplied relevant information paper. So this will be kept on the list of items to be considered. Now, Mrs. Yip is not here, but let me invite the government officials to join us first, in particular the new Secretary for the Civil Service. Deputy Chairman, yes, please come forward. Thank you. Welcome, new Secretary for the Service, Mr. Joshua Law, for coming to our meeting for the first time. And then Mr. Mack is next to him. Secretary, before you joined us, we were just talking about the issue raised by Mrs. Regina concerning the shortage of manpower in the Occupational Safety Officer grade of the Labour Department. Now, in the October meeting, can we take up this issue for discussion, please? Because Mrs. Ip and members of the panel are all very much concerned about this issue. Because, you know, the Occupational Safety Officer grade is an important grade in inspecting major works projects, and they play an important role in ensuring the safety of workers. So when can we take up that discussion, please, as soon as possible? Secretary? Well, yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know that the panel is concerned about the manpower situation of the Occupational Safety Officer grade. Perhaps after the summer break, we will discuss with the Chairman and the Deputy Chairman about the schedule for next year. So perhaps we'll decide on which meeting we will take this up. Thank you. So please try to do it as soon as possible. Item 3 on the agenda, updated overview of post-service outside work by directorate civil servants. Paper number CB bracket 4 1384/16 to 17 bracket 01 and 02. A paper from the administration and a paper prepared by the Secretariat. Mr. Law, can you please take us through the paper? Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I am attending this meeting for the first time as the Secretary for Civil Service. In the next few years, I will do my very best to keep in close communication with members and listen to your views and aspirations. I hope to build a good partnership relationship with you. This item is to brief members on the latest position and an updated overview of post-service outside work by directorate civil servants. Now, there are two guiding principles. That is to ensure that staff could, directorate staff could take up outside work, which is their right, and at the same time to prevent any real or potential conflict of interest with their former government duties. Especially, we don't want to have the public perception that may embarrass the government and undermine the image of the civil service by giving rise to a reasonable apprehension of deferred reward or benefit. But at the same time, we want to make sure that the individual's right to work after ceasing government service will not be duly restricted, and thereby undermining the appeal of the civil service as a career. Now, apart from unpaid work in non-commercial organizations, directorate staff must seek permission before they could take up work after retirement. The key principle is that there must not be impropriety in reference work, and there are several criteria to go by. First of all, within a specified period before the applicant leaves the civil service, whether his work is in any way related to the post he's applying for, and whether that he's been involved in formulation of any policies or decisions, the effects of which could directly or indirectly benefit or have benefited the prospective employer, whether the prospective employer might gain an unfair advantage over competitors concerned because of the applicant's access to sensitive information, or whether it could give rise to any conflict of interest, deferred reward, or other impropriety or reference public suspicion. In the past, between 2012 and 2016, we have processed 301 applications. 289 were approved, and about 65% were related to work with non-commercial organizations. The current regime was launched in 2011 after detailed deliberations and consultation of relevant parties. We will invite the Independent Advisory Committee on Post-Service Employment of Civil Servants to render service advice to the Secretary on every application. So the SCS, for all the views put forward by the ACPE and the decisions, these are all uploaded to our website for public inspection. There is a register on that. And also, we will submit any report for consideration. So that's by way of a brief introduction of the paper. Thank you. Now the floor is open to questions from members. One member has put up, or two rather, have put up their hands. Mr. Justin Lam and Mr. Poon Siu Ping. Mr. Lam, 5 minutes. Question and answers, please. Now about the post-service outside work arrangement by director civil servants, I would like to share with you my first-hand experience, Secretary. In the professional grades of the government, there were directorate civil servants who joined private companies after they left the government. And these private companies took on many government contracts. And for that person in question, he was in charge of the revenue work. Of course, he's gone through the sanitization period. But my question is, in a case like that, and we see there were people who were previously the assistant director or deputy director, and then they go to work for a private company to deal with works and projects, or actually monitored by his previous department. And what is his role? His role is to approach the subordinates of the subordinates of the subordinates of the subordinates of his previous colleague, and then he just responsible for entertaining these people. And of course, not every such case could eventually go to court. So as the new secretary for the civil service, for civil servants leaving the government, especially directorate staff, if they apply to you to work in a private company, and for that company it's actually had close business dealings with the government, then shouldn't your vetting criteria be even more stringent? Thank you, Ms. Lam, for your questions. Well, under the current mechanism, we have a strict mechanism in vetting each and every application. For the civil servant leaving his post, we would ask him to provide the scope of work of his for his prospective employer, and then in a certain period in the past, say 3 to 6 years, he has to provide all the information in relation to his official duties, which may be in any way related to his prospective employer, and then we will look into it in depth as to whether there's any conflict of interest. But of course, I cannot discuss individual cases here, but in the information provided, we want to make sure that there won't be any deferred benefit or reward or any conflict of interest. We would pass on all the information to the independent advisory committee on post-service employment of civil servants. So we'll consult the advisory committee, and we will take on board the recommendations of the advisory committee, ACPE, before we make any decision. Can I ask the secretary explain to us, within how many years must such civil servants apply to you to take up such job after they leave the civil service? Well, the rules are specific. Probably, well, usually there would be a final leave period. Of course, during the leave period. Now, I'm not talking about leave period, Mr. Chairman, Secretary. No, please, can you let me finish? Now, if they work in non-commercial organizations or they take up unpaid work, other than that, we would not approve any such applications during the final leave period. And then there is a sanitization period for about 2 years. Or 3 years. 2 years or 3 years. There are 2 types of sanitization period. For a directorate, a D8 officer is 3 years, and below D8 is 2 years. Now, after the sanitization period, does it mean then there's no control whatsoever? The person is free to do whatever he wants? I'm sorry, please let me clarify. I was just talking about a control period, but for the sanitization period, is about a certain period after the person leaves. If he's a D8 officer, then it's 12 months. If he's below D8, usually is 6 months. For applications submitted within the sanitization period, or these must be sent to the Civil Service Bureau. Even if it's the control period, during the control period they have to make application, but after 3 years there's no longer a need for application. So after 3 years there's no control whatsoever then. While our considerations were that in 2011 we conducted an extensive review. We believe that the sanitization and control period, as compared to the arrangements in place in other countries, are already more stringent. You may line up to speak again, Mr. Lam. Next, Mr. Poon. Well, about civil servants taking up post outside work, we have to ensure public interest at the same time. We need to strike a balance with the individual's right to employment. So These is a important consideration in the mechanism. So my first question, for directorate staff, if they resign or retire, are there two different sets of arrangements for the sanitization and control period? Now, in 2009, the system was put in place. It's almost 10 years now. And this mechanism, in terms of the vetting procedure or how liberal the vetting is and so on, would you do another review? Or how often would you do a review? Secretary? Well, let me take the second question first. Mr. Poon, my understanding is asking whether we would do a review of the mechanism, because you did it in 2009, right? Well, two committees conducted review, and then in 2011, this mechanism was put in place. It's a new mechanism since then. And so far, we believe the mechanism has been working well, so we have no plans to conduct any major review in the near term. But of course, if members have any comments, then in our day-to-day vetting work, we will bear in mind those comments. First point about the sanitization period, control period, whether it's a case of retirement or non-retirement, that means resignation. I will ask Mr. Mack to give you more details. Thank you. On the sanitization period, Mr. Poon asks whether there is a difference if someone resigns or retires. For resignation, there is not a preset sanitization period. We're talking about colleagues quitting. So we have to look at each case individually, and then we will decide on the sanitization period. As for retirees, yes, there is a preset sanitization period. Let's say we are talking about D1 to D3 officers, then the sanitization period is 6 months. For D4 to D8 officers, the sanitization period is 12 months. Here we're talking about the sanitization period. The second type of period is control period. Now, for retiring or retired officers, for D1 to D7 officers, the control period is 2 years. As for D8 officers, control period is 3 years. Here we're talking about retired colleagues. For non-retiring colleagues, if they have served 6 years or more in the government, then the control period is the same as for retired colleagues. But for colleagues having served less than 6 years and leaving not because of retirement, then for D1 to D7 officers, the control period is 1 year. D8 officer, 1.5 years. So that's how the system works. Thank you. In other words, if for staff not working for more than 6 years, the control period is relatively shorter. What are the considerations for that? No, well, the considerations are, we're talking about a staff who leaves before retirement, say staff hired on contract, and such as colleagues may be hired for a short period, let's say a 3-year contract. We cannot therefore have an unreasonably long control period for someone who's got a contract for just 3 years. So that's why we also have to consider the length of service of that colleague in the civil service. So the design of mechanism is such that it must be in line with the spirit of the law. That is, there has to be a proportionality. That is, the time he spends working in the government at the time of the control period, that must be proportionate. Thank you. Next, Deputy Chairman, Mr. Jeremy Tam. Thank you. Apology. Now, Mr. Chairman, can I use a case to demonstrate the loophole I see? These civil service the Civil Aviation Department bought the AT3. We all know that, and then something happened. That's a fact too. Mr. Leung Pui Kwong, the Chief Air Traffic Officer, I think he's a D1 officer. He retired in 2006, and then he became a contract staff of the Civil Aviation Department. And then in 2009, Mr. Leung joined the vetting committee for the procurement of the new air traffic control system. So the committee decided which system to procure. And then in 2011, the CAD bought the current AT3 system from Regina. And then Mr. Leung finished his contract. He then went to work for a subcontractor of Raytheon. So that gave people a very strong suspicion of deferred benefit. Well, perhaps under your system, there's nothing wrong with that because it's past his sanitization period, control period, and then he's no longer a civil servant. Because he's a contract staff. Now, I don't want to discuss this particular case as to whether there is deferred benefit, but it gives a very poor perception to the public. For cases like this, would you revise your procedures in any way? Because the person is actually still working for the government, but that could still lead to some form of deferred benefit. So how do you deal with that? Secretary, for directorate staff taking up post-service employment in a private company, we would consider all relevant information to see whether there's any deferred benefit. And also look at the work done by the officer before he left. I've already explained that, so I don't propose to repeat those points. Now, there are also certain restrictions on the nature of work. May I refer you to a footnote on page 3 of the paper, work restrictions. The Directorate civil servants will not directly or indirectly be involved in the bidding for any government's land, property, projects, contracts, or franchises, or represent any person in any work that are connected in any way with formulation of any policy or decisions, sensitive information, contractual or legal dealings, etc., during their last 3 years of services. And the point C is whether that will cause embarrassment to the government or bring disgrace, blah, blah, blah. Now, I do not know about the specifics of the case you mentioned, and it is also not appropriate for us to discuss the details of the case here. But I'm sure when he applied to take up such employment, I'm sure the relevant parties would have vetted carefully whether he was involved in any decision that would allow his prospective employer to have any unfair advantage over competitors. If that was the judgment formed, it's possible there were some restrictions on his employment, but I don't have the information at hand. Thank you. I get that. I fully agree with what you said. But let's not talk about this particular case. For this type of case, the main difference is that the person has left the government. He's retired, and then the department asked him to come back and do the same work, but on a contract basis. So he's a contract staff. And then, as to what you said, it's true. He's no longer a civil servant. He's definitely not a directorate civil servant anymore. So the sanitization period, control period, it doesn't matter whether it's 3 years or 2 years. He's gone past that because by the time he's finished his government contract, it will be 4 or 5 years after he left the civil service. But then he's still doing exactly the same work. But as soon as he finished his contract, then he joined a company that was in dealings with him when he was a contract staff. I think I have stated the case very clearly. Do you get it? Now, for that staff member, it depends. The restrictions depend on his contract conditions or clauses. Now, if when we vet such cases, as I said, we still go by the same principle. That is, he should not. There should not be any deferred reward, or there shouldn't be any cause of embarrassment to the government. Mr. Mack. Now, I'm in no position to comment on individual cases here. But Mr. Tam mentioned that, say, if a staff member has retired, and then there is a sanitization period or control period that's is passed to, but perhaps at the time he's contract staff, or it could be NCSC or the latest post-retirement service contract. So then what do we do with cases like that? Actually, under our mechanism, we could have a parallel approach. By that, what we can do is, say, when a colleague has retired from the civil service, then of course he is under the control of the reference mechanism. That's the first point. And second point, if he then takes up contract employment with the government, and then the department concerned believed that for that particular contract work that could lead to deferred reward or conflict of interest, then in the contract terms, then arrangements similar to our control regime could be put into the contract so as to impose restrictions on employment after the expiry of the contract. So this is a parallel approach, and I hope that could address your concern.
Deputy Chairman, maybe we have raised a safe for second round of questioning. Mr. Oh, thank you, Chairman. I think that and due to the protection of public interests and the protection of individual rights to work under these principles, I think the Directorate Civil Service, I think after they left the control is necessary. I think this is a lengthy discussion in the public concerning this issue. I'm reading from this document. I see the government proposed in the 2016, and the administration had refused the application for outside work by Directorate Civil Servants. Can the administration say in rather general terms rather than specific cases? And what are the grounds of rejection? And after the applications were rejected, so what would be the arrangements to those applicants? And in the document, the public and I are quite concerned that how's the transparency that could be respond to the public concerns? From the document, you written that you would put the register up on the online for the public inspection. I would like to ask the Civil Service Bureau, would you consider enhanced transparency to allow the public to dispel any worries on the public? As for the refuse the applications, generally, we notice that we have led to give rise to deferred award or conflict of interest. So this is rather on general terms rather than commenting on specific grounds. And for the civil servant concerned, if we have any dissatisfaction to the verdict, they could actually appeal to Chief Executive. If the Chief Executive uphold or set aside the Secretary of Civil Service decision, and the applicant is still not satisfied, he could go to the court and ask for judicial review. So this is the information on the rejected applications. The second question on the transparency issue. Would put the all the terms have been informed by the applicant, and all these restrictions are uploaded to the website of the Civil Service Bureau register. which is available for public inspection. And we also urge the applicant to disclose to the employer of the restrictions and report regularly, so whether that have been comply with the restrictions. Like Mr. Beckett mentioned, maybe there's some individual cases, additional conditions might be imposed, and we will follow up rigorously. So the Secretary haven't quite answered my question. So the second part of my second question is that now that the public seems to have a lot of doubts on the transparency, are you willing to tell the public that to review or enhance the transparency? So is a better question, well, you're willing or not? Chairman, thank you, Mr. Oh's comments. On the transparency matter, we do have a register which I consider to be quite open. At this stage, I don't see strong justifications to conduct a review. We have noted Mr. Oh's comments, and we'll have further considered it when the right time comes. I hope the Secretary could give a written reply on this transparency issue, because what you said in contrast to what the public had the perception, and the public was quite concerned that for the Directorate Civil Servants, for the information posted on the register, whether the information could be increased or to be enhanced. Ms. Chang. Thank you, Chairman. First of all, on behalf of the DAB, I would welcome Mr. Joshua Lott to attending the panel on public service meeting first time. And under the Chairman's leadership, this panel is rather moderate in tone and quite nice. And we have raised a lot of views with the former Secretary for Civil Service, where we think the Civil Service Bureau should conduct a review. And I hope that Mr. Law could pay attention to our concerns. So it's going to be we plenty of time ahead, especially the review on the establishment of the remuneration of civil servants, especially the retirement age of disciplined forces. As well, this is the top concern, because you probably meet them quite a few times. I think there's a few areas that they're worthy of consideration. I will arrange an appointment with you later. And for today's topic, I wish to follow up that based on the statistics provided, and on the number of applications for outside work, how many of them have actually reached retirement age and leave the CS ranks? Do we have such data available? Do we have such information at hand? And Chairman, what I can tell is that we do not particularly collect data to whether a colleague have reached retirement age, because for some civil servants, they could be under the old system converted to the new system. They could either retire at 55 or 65. So at least 55 or 60 rather. So they may not apply for retirement at 60. So maybe they could apply at around 55 or so. However, they have not reached the normal retirement age and yet did so. So in response to Ms. Chang's question, so what do you really want to know? I would like to know, they have to work after retirement. For these kind of applicants, so they have to resign and apply for work, so that was understandable, but not. So they all reach 60 and beyond, and which is so many applicants for outside work. So what kind of job they're applying for? So it reached 60, And like you said, there are sanitation control period, so altogether it's 2 to 3 years in total. So after 2 to 3 years to get to 63, 64, and then they would apply for permission for outside work. So why? So if there are at early retirement, so what is the reason? For the early retirement, you mentioned in 2014 and 15, every year there are around 84. There are 68K applications and 84 in 2015. The number seems to be quite huge because we're talking about directorate civil CS. So why do they leave the CS rank before they reach retirement and seek outside employment instead? I hope you can provide some detailed information on this later. And separately, I would like to follow up on whether you have compiled the relevant statistics, about which how many of them that they have gone through the sanitation and control period and engaged in the work that related to the duties at the time is the civil service. So we do not have such information, and we will not collect them either. But of course, you have a record, so I can forgive you. I know they have information at hand. However, you have to keep record of such because we care about these civil servants. So after retirement, we keep track on them, how they're doing, or whether they are having a hard time, or maybe the government should improve the remuneration for civil servants. So why they living it up, or maybe they don't have a flat roof over their head, or maybe they promise them public housing, or maybe for the CS cooperative, maybe you promise them a flat, and yet nobody we wanted. So even for 2 to 3 million couldn't buy you anything in Hong Kong, not even in China. So this undeniably is a top concern to everyone. So let's say there could be individual cases. However, these cases may spread. So as for the head of civil service, you should preemptively see from the perspective of civil servants to make sure that the any aspirations are communicated. And my last question would be, how many have indirect or direct financial interests and yet have passed the sanitation and control period and engage in such kind of work? Or just, let me put it bluntly, so just cut to the chase. Because very often some departments where huge sum of money is involved. So at the meetings when there's something going over budget, asking for extra funding, and then that could make me quite angry. I'm speaking from the heart. So let's say for this officials concerned, maybe after retirement they could join those relevant companies. Because we should care for them about this. Secretary, please be assured that after you retire, I think it's quite difficult to transfer to work in a company where you have a direct interest. So looking at the 13 bureaus, the prospect quite big. However, I see some departments, if such situation arisen, I think that we should be concerned. So maybe you should ask your colleague to follow up and look at the situation just to get an idea of what's going on. So after you maybe get more information, I can ask you again this question.
Thank you. Let me try to respond to Dr. N. Chan. Well, thank you very much for your concern about our civil servants. As the Secretary for the Civil Service, of course, I care very much about the livelihood and the post-retirement situation of my colleagues. Today, we are talking about post-service outside work by directorate civil servants. You asked whether they could, well, how come they could still they could get public housing and so on, but I don't believe that is entirely relevant to this item under discussion. Now, in 2011, we started a new mechanism. We considered for how long we should impose a control period. There was much discussion whether the period should be longer or shorter. Now the control period is 3 years. Sanitization period maybe half a year or a year. So altogether 4 years or so. Compared to the practice in other countries, we have actually a more stringent mechanism in place. Of course, we care about the kind of work people take up after the control period. Now, of course, if they come and apply after the control period, we won't try to collect information on where he goes to work and so on. But if we have to follow up on that, that may bring pressure to bear on the colleague concerned. And that's against the principle that on the one hand we want to safeguard public interest, that there won't be any conflict of interest. On the other, the right to work of the individual might be has to be safeguarded. So we need to strike a balance, and that's why after the control period we would not collect information systematically. But when we liaise with the parties concerned, we will try to find out how they do after retirement, or if the government is able to render assistance anyway and so on. We will continue to look at that. Mr. Chairman, I talk about information of directorate civil servants, how many only apply for outside work after retirement, or how many have not yet reached retirement but they quit and apply for outside work. I think you need to provide the relevant figures, and those are directly relevant to the subject under discussion. I hope the Secretary will let this panel have the relevant information. The second point, that is, after 3 years, whether the work is directly related in any way. I think the Secretary must also provide the information. Well, yes, you said you did consider before whether it should be 3 years, 4 years, or 2 years. We've all given much thought to that, and there was still much controversy. Maybe then in future, when you do review, you have to reconsider the point, and the information must be ready for your consideration. Well, in that case, why don't you just prepare the information now, especially now because colleagues ask you? Then you should take a look. There's nothing wrong taking a look unless you say you're too busy. But then in future, if you come and apply for any post, then we have to consider whether we could let you have more manpower, or if you say that you're not too busy, you're able to do that, then great. If you need to hire more people in future, it will be much easier. Yes, thank you, Dr. Chen. You could wait till the second round. I have a number of questions for you. It's now my turn, Secretary. Of course, the Civil Service Bureau has its own regulations, and you try to draw a line somewhere, whether it's for the sanitization or control period. So now you've drawn that line. But on public demands for transparency, and then for perception of individual cases, they would all affect the confidence of the public in the system. So my first question is, there's going to be a rush of retirement. For this Advisory Committee on Post-Service Employment of Civil Servants, ACPE, how long does it take to consider each case? And if there's going to be a rush of retirement in coming years, would it add to their workload? Would they be able to process the applications in time? That's the first question. Second question, I'd like to pick up on what Mr. Justin Lam asked. For certain colleagues, they meet all your requirements, they're given approval to work in a commercial organization, but then what they do there would very much be related to their colleagues still in the department. If they meet with these colleagues, they could lead to a negative perception. So are they just catching up, or are they talking business? So is there any restriction or control on that? That's my second question. Now my third question. In the past 5 years, you dealt with some 307 cases. What are the ranks, the range of the ranks of these cases? Don't give me as an average, because that doesn't help us see the picture. The last question. Deputy Chairman asked about a case earlier. Now, I cannot confirm whether the case is real or not, but having heard the Deputy Chairman's questions, I feel compelled to ask this. After retirement, there will be a sanitization or control period, but then the thing is he's become a contract staff during that period. So his service on contract, does it count towards the sanitization or control period? That's important. Now, of course, the civil service has a certain set of rules to go by, but does it mean that if they meet the requirements, then you always approve the application, or is it the case that for the independent advisory committee, it's given room to consider other issues? For instance, Mr. Tam, the Deputy Chairman, mentioned a case. Well, it seems is not right, just looking at it. So, as you consider the case, would you add any other points on top of the original requirements to make sure there's a better safeguard? Secretary. Now, on the processing time. Now, if someone wants to join a non-commercial organization, we hope that within 17 working days the application could be approved. But if it's an application to join a commercial organization, usually it's 28 working days. And the counting starts from the time when all information is submitted properly. Now, sometimes the cases drag on for a long time is because after we have studied the case, then we may ask the relevant colleague or the bureau or department he's worked at to provide information. So with some back and fro, it may take time to gather all the information, and that's why we may not be able to meet the performance pledge. Now, for the advisory committee, we don't set any time limits for them, but the advisory committee meets irregularly for straightforward cases. For instance, where there is no suspicion of conflict of interest, or where it involves a non-commercial organization, then the ACP may be able to render their views very quickly. But for the more complex cases, the committee may need more time. That's why we need to allow sufficient time for the committee to consider cases. On safeguarding the rights of civil servants to work, we have at the same time to make sure that the vetting procedure is stringent. That's in response to your first question. Second question. Meeting up with old colleagues, would that lead to suspicion of conflict of interest? Well, then I think we'll have to look at the facts. We can't say that one person sits down together with another person for a coffee or a meal, and then we will speculate on the motive. Now, for any such allegations or suspicion, they must be based on facts. The third question about the ranks, the range of the ranks. In the past 5 years, well, there are some figures. Oh, there's not the total here. Let's say for 2016, D1 to D3, 34 approved. Oh, application, sorry. 34 applications, D1 to D3 officers, D4 to D8, 9 applications. 2015, D1 to D3 officers, 40, D4 to D8, 11 applicants. Not 8, sorry. Okay, so we can give you the figures for each year after the meeting. So that means there are officers at every level then? Yes, correct. About the sanitization period, control period, and the contract period. Well, once a civil servant leaves his post, then the sanitization and the control period take effect. As for the contract, it goes in parallel. That means during the contract period, the provisions on the sanitization and control period for civil servants remain valid. That means during the contract period, they cannot go back. Yes, I get that, Secretary. I get it as soon as you say it's in parallel. But the Deputy Chairman's concern is that during the contract period, he is still had power to make decisions. It's not just any regular staff. So for this particular case, has the advisory committee considered that particular aspect? I'm sorry, I don't know much about the case. I'm not able to answer. Next, Dr. Fernando Zhang, 5 minutes, please. Questions and answers. Thank you. For civil servants retiring or senior officials retiring, many of them may go back to the business sector, and then they take up jobs in the business sector, and that does give a rather negative perception. It also leads to concerns as to whether there's some sort of understanding while they were still imposed. Now, you have sanitization period and control period. Yes, that's a good mechanism, but from the figures over the years, it seems that even for the control period, over 90% of the applications were approved, so that's a high percentage. And also the control period mechanism is not transparent. We do not know who is given approval, who is not, and we don't know what the basis for that. As for sanitization period, is really short, just 6 months or 1 year. For some posts, it's just 6 months. That's really worrying. So I'd like to make suggestion. Please add another layer. That means there's a limited scope of employment. Or rather, it depends on the scope of service of that individual in the last 5 years of service. So his duties in the last 5 years of service may lead to lengthened control period. I would say the control period should be 5 years. So within the same scope of work, he cannot be paid to take up similar work after retirement. But you might say it's a waste of talents because someone has a prominent standing in the civil aviation sector. What if he wants to contribute after he retires to the same industry? Fine, no problem. People can make contribution. No one's against that. But if they get paid, then it leads to the suspicion whether they've been in any funny business with the sector before retirement. So that's my specific suggestion. Please consider it. Perhaps that means on top of the existing mechanism, add another layer. And then it will give people the assurance that civil servants would not benefit from their past services as in civil service posts.
Chairman, Mr. Chung's raised 2 points. First, on the advisory committee's work seems to be quite opaque, or don't know on what are the grounds for providing consideration of the cases. And does the annual report of the advisory committee was actually submitted to the LegCo, and where it described the work of the committee, and was just submitted last month. And inside there's some figures. However, there were no specific comment on individual cases. However, the advice and on what justification or grounds would the advisory committee consider these applications? As for whether it's necessary to extend the control period, as from my understand, and back in 2011, at the last extensive review, we already explored that in depth. That we found that it's not suitable or inappropriate to forbid Directorate Civil Service to engage in particular line of work. And this, we have consulted external legal advice, who regarded this restriction would lead to legal challenges and may not pass, like I mentioned, the proportionality test. In this regard, we need to take note that we do have a rigorous vetting procedures, and this mechanism will consider the knowledge and the contacts he gained from his time in the civil service to make them to decide whether he should accept this offers from the private sector. So we need to strike a balance between the two. So if the advisory committee thinks this is not possible, so that's like my proposal of having banning engaging in paid work in specific areas. I think this sanitization period must be extended, because a 6 month to 1 year, this is way too short. He would able to use his old contacts or relationships to help him or her in his future employment prospects. That will lead to a very bad public perception. If you extend it to 3 years with 5 is actually better. Otherwise, it will be less than effective. As for a 6 to 12 month sanitization period, generally, unless you would take part in a non-commercial organization or engage in unpaid work, then we would approve such application. Last question, Mr. Yip Kin Yun. 5 minutes with question and answers. For the second round, how many members would like to speak? 2. Because I need to draw the line. Because we need to go to the next, move to the next agenda item. So, Mr. Yip, 5 minutes. Chairman, my impression of retiring directorate civil servants, now that they are seeking for post-service outside work, there seems to be more of them than in the past. Correct me if I'm wrong. So in the civil service mechanism, we do have something called a pension, and hoping that after retirement, the civil service will not have to worry about their livelihood. So if for economic reasons they need to work afterwards, so that seems to run against the intention of providing a pension. So now that so there's only about 4 cases are rejected. About most of them seem to sell through and improved. So this will give rise to a negative perception on the part of the public, especially some of the directorate civil servants, when they apply for external outside work, or rather at big companies or conglomerates. These conglomerates and the directorate civil servants before, with the understanding reached before their retirement, these are the concerns that have been raised by my colleagues, and I believe these worries are rather concrete. I think we need to address this, otherwise the credibility of the government will fall into suspicion. Like Dr. Chung have mentioned of extending the sanitization period, I think this is worth to consider. I would also like to ask that besides the vetting, would you have any sort of guidelines or even regulations that besides whether to allow them to engage in particular line of work, whether do we restrict them to engaging any sort of behavior, or what should be allowed and what shouldn't be allowed. For example, would they able to catch up with their old colleagues? So maybe it's just not reasonable to forbid them catching up with their old colleagues and so forth. However, when it comes to discussing things, isn't some guidelines should be in place to let them know what is allowed and what isn't? So do we have any such things in place? In Appendix C, so we talk about unpaid work. So can you brief the situation? Even though this unpaid work, but we still would like to know more. Because I'm arrived late, I'm not sure if it's been covered before. But sorry for repeating. So, thank you for Mr. Yip's question. You mentioned that that a civil servant has a pension, thus it should not be in a hurry to look for employment. Thus, in the 2011 review, the committee have actually looked into it, and the opinion was that the post-retirement remuneration is a reward for their long time spent in civil service rank, and should not be used as justification to deprive them to seek outside work after leaving civil service. And back then, we had give that into consideration. And so what sort of guidelines or regulations in place? So let's say for the civil service at the directorate level of having spent so many years in their ranks, and they should have a pretty good idea of what would give right suspicion, and thus it's very difficult to establish something like a school rules as in limiting the number of drinks they could have with your friend, or meeting how many times that would consider to be suspicious. Though we do need facts to ascertain whether these contacts would lead to perception of impropriety or collusion. I believe that everyone would have a clear idea. Yes, I don't see the government could really hold your hands that what should or should not be done. If we found that there would be a case of deferred reward, we would definitely take action. Good. Now we enter second round of questioning. So we just draw the line. We have two members who would like to ask a question. Mr. Tam, 2 minutes. Thank you, Chairman. I would like to follow up on the issue contract staff. Like I said, I would not like to use a particular case for you to answer it throughout. I'm just saying that this could be a possibility. In my opinion, the advisory committees would only look into the civil service, but not the contract staff. Well, maybe the secretary mentioned that maybe you could have such provisions in the contracts. However, if you do that in each individual contract, it's rather unsystematic, or because there will be chances that you may miss something, or maybe you could just miss out that maybe could be changes in their work duties, or cope with any change in circumstances. So if that person was a former directorate civil servant, or his line of work was had the same duties as a directorate civil servant, so let's say we'd have a standard provision in the contract that would have stated so, and maybe you could set a timeline with reference to the restrictions on directorate civil servants. So can we give you some thought, Secretary? Chairman. For our contract colleagues, their contracts do comes with their own unique restrictions. So these are not ordinary CS positions. Because NCS position, we would outline their duties and scope of work in rather general terms, because they do have decades of experience. When they engage in contract work, this is a rather prescriptive provisions that clearly outline their duties. Therefore, our consideration is that for the contract staff, for their post-service outside work, we are rather less restrictive on that. So, however, if we see that there could potential conflict, we could able to insert additional clauses. Ms. Chang, 2 minutes. And Chairman, I hope the Secretary, I think just the negative public suspicion or misunderstanding. So we should try to protect this as much as possible. As for the case of Mr. Leung Chee-man, at the end there's no evidence pointing Leung Chee-man engaging in any particular behavior. And actually he had went past the sanitation control period. However, there's still give rise to suspicion the whether that because you have been the head of head of housing department, that would give rise to suspicion in steering such a huge controversy. I think he was quite miserable. So if within the control sanitization period you were able to impose it on that, so he should be allowed to do so. So at the end it would lead to PNP inquiry. So maybe he left us on 2011 in July. So back in 2008, he worked at a particular company, so the time isn't long enough. So if you look at the incident, so let's say even for 3 years, he still worked for the same company, and this company seemed to have some dealings back in when he was his position. People would just stick it up. The thing would still happen regardless. So you are bringing them trouble. So let me tell you, this is quite special. So you've been investigating about the ICAC, a lot of questioning, and so forth. So at the end, maybe no impropriety was found, but actually he was a good official back then because you have such a loophole. So somehow this is worth reviewing to protect them. I disagree with Dr. Cheng. Because I've seen a lot of directorate civil servants that once they leave the CS rank, they engage in different line of work, so not necessarily unpaid work. So I appreciate that because they reach 60 and they seem to be in good health and have a lot of knowledge. So even when they go to teaching, they'll be welcome in a lot of schools and universities. So even that they'll be popular with big companies to help in the management. So where there's not a huge approval matters of communication, so maybe we can work on the wording. So if not, there will be a repeat of the same thing that will cause embarrassment to the government. So for this agenda item, I think we had expressed our views and knew that the CSB had these regulations in place and basically should address most of the situation, just some isolated cases about which to tighten the scrutiny. So some reviews proposed, and for the whether in individual cases the control period should be extended. I raised to Mr. Cheng. I hope that you would look into it and get further discuss this, and hope that you can brief us on the progress later. So let me just reply briefly on the case of Mr. Leung. Back then, he was still within the control period. So it passed the sanitation period, but not the control period. So that was this incident that we have two committees, and we also have an independent committee. So in 2011, from now on, we have this more stringent control mechanism. so which actually in place until now. So I agreed with the chairman that we heard your views, and do you think that where on specific cases that we need to know more about, we would have a timely review of the mechanism for room for improvement. So we now move to agenda item number 4.
壓力嘅管理文件呢，就係 CB4嘅13。
The administrations on the managing work-related stress in civil service, CB 41384-1617-03.
主席。
Mr. Law, please. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Because of the changing demands of the public, the government civil servants must keep improving themselves and its efficiency to keep up with the times. But in dealing with changes, some civil servants may face certain stress arising from work, and some may need to seek help to cope with stress. Now, in the paper we submitted, we have explained how the government adopts a two-pronged approach to help civil servants to cope with stress at work. On the one hand, the government provides professional counseling service to staff in need. On the other hand, we have preventive measure by organizing training and educational programs to help staff develop the necessary skills for managing stress, and also we are promoting a balanced and healthy lifestyle. First, on counseling services. Since 2002, the Civil Service Bureau has been providing a hotline counseling service scheme to offer professional counseling services to help staff cope with stress arising from work and their personal problems. The Bureau currently engages Christian Family Service Center to provide counseling services to the staff of some 60 bureau and departments, about 85,000 staff members in total, and that includes non-civil service contract staff. The services provided include telephone counseling service, face-to-face counseling, and referrals to referent parties, as well as workshops. There are 11 departments with about 10,000 staff, which provided with dedicated counseling services other than the scheme I mentioned. They may be counselors or clinical psychologists to provide counseling, or these departments may engage professional counseling agencies to provide counseling services to their staff. To strengthen the provision of counseling service to civil servants, a professional clinical psychologist has been employed by the Department of Health to provide clinical psychology services to civil service eligible persons, CSEPs, at the Families Clinic since March 2016. From 2017 to 18, the services will be enhanced by the addition of 2 clinical psychologists. And if civil servants need to receive counseling services provided by clinical psychologists of the families' clinics, they may apply for time off from duty. Starting from the 1st of this month, the time off arrangement has been extended to cover counseling services provided to civil servants by clinical psychologists during working hours and the dedicated counseling service provided by the 11 departments. Next, I'd like to talk about training and educational programs. As a preventive measure, we encourage supervisors to get to understand more about the problems faced by their subordinates and provide timely assistance. At the same time, we organize different training programs and educational activities to equip staff with the necessary skills for managing stress and to promote a balanced and healthy lifestyle. These programs and activities include different workshops and seminars to help colleagues to deal with stress. On the website of the Civil Service Training and Development Institute, CSTSI, we also provide resources on work-life balance and positive lifestyle. And also different departments organize training programs to meet the specific operational needs of the staff on stress management and positive outlook on life. And also, departments may organize educational and recreational activities to promote balanced and healthy lifestyle. On top of these three aspects, there's a fourth one. The CSB has promulgated guidelines on personal safety at work to help Bureau and departments to compile departmental guidelines for dealing with situations that may affect their staff's personal safety. And also, there are activities to promote a healthy work environment, including seminars to help staff develop the necessary skills for coping with stress at work. So that's by way of a brief introduction on our work in this respect. Look forward to an exchange of views with members. Thank you. Deputy Chairman, Mr. Tam, Mr. Pun Siu Ping, Dr. N. Chan and I have indicated our wish to speak. So first, Mr. Tam, Jeremy Tam, on stress faced by civil servants. We very much concerned about that. I think just 2 meetings ago, we're told resources have been increased to provide counseling, and we support that. So my question, paragraph 5 of the paper, you mentioned there are some service agencies taking calls. How many such organizations are there? Just one, or how many? You also mentioned 490 telephone counseling sessions. How long is the session? 50 minutes, 30 minutes? So that's my first question. For telephone counseling service is now provided by the Christian Family Service Center. So that's just one provider of the service. And the provider was engaged through open tendering. Starting from 2006, the Christian Family Service Center has been providing the service. You mean session, one session, how long is a session? How many minutes? 490 telephone counseling sessions. So how long each session? Or it just means session doesn't have a fixed duration? Well, the counseling duration, of course, depends on the case. On average, each session is about 45 to 60 minutes. Okay, my next question is related to something we talked about several meetings ago, which is about the departure of civil servants. You mentioned about 55% of the civil servants quit, of those cases of resignations as to do with work stress. Perhaps you could give me the figures after the meeting. I know you won't have them here. But I think what we need to look at is the AO grade and the EO grade in the past 5 to 10 years. I'm talking about resignations, not retirement, okay? I'm talking about the number of resignation cases. Can you give us the figures after the meeting? Of course, I know there are more than these grades in the civil service. I want to look at the AO grades and the EO grades and see what changes there are. Yes, I will provide figures after. I don't have another question. Oh, no, sorry. Yes, I still have time, so I can ask another question. You mentioned recreational activities. Yes, it's good to have more recreational activities, especially engaging in such activities together with the family, the children, or for the younger civil servants together with their parents. So I hope that the recreational activities will be for the whole family, not just the civil servants, and I believe there will be a better participation rate. And you have good names, laughter, yoga, whatever, but the positive psychology seems a bit rigid, as if it's going to a lesson. So something that's happy, something for the whole family to enjoy. You should name activities that way, okay? Yes, I agree with Mr. Tam. In the past 5 years, when I was the permanent secretary for the Security Bureau, every year, actually started before my term, but every year we have a sports day of the Bureau, and all staff members and their family members are welcome. And then we have 8 departments under the Security Bureau. All their staff members and family members, if they've been involved in the work of the Security Bureau anyway, we welcome them all to the sports day. It's a very good opportunity for colleagues to de-stress and to foster communication. Next, Mr. Pun Siu Ping. The Secretary mentioned that they help civil servants to cope with stress at work. One is to provide professional counseling service, and the other aspect is to take preventive measures. Now, in 2016, the service provider that takes calls from staff, there are 290 civil servants and 500 calls have been taken. Now, for these 290 colleagues, how many of them would have been referred to the family's clinic for treatment? And how long, on average, is referral? That's the first question. Now, at the family's clinic, there's one clinical psychologist to provide service. Since the psychologist was engaged in 2016, how many cases have been dealt with? Now you're going to add 2 more psychologists, and what's the progress? In the paper, it's said that when colleagues call for 55% of the cases, they have to do with work, like a relationship with their supervisors or peers, or the public and so on. So the stress mostly comes from work. Our office received a case recently. There's a civil servant's colleague who's been the subject of an anonymous complaint, and then investigation was conducted, and then the complaint was not substantiated, but the department still sent written advice and asked him to sign it, and he was under much pressure. Now, of course, sometimes pressure comes from the disciplinary mechanism of the department concerned, especially for anonymous complaint that's not substantiated. Still, advisory letter is issued and a colleague is asked to sign it. For this sort of arrangement, would the Civil Service Bureau review the arrangement of different departments in relation to such cases? Secretary, let me take the last question first. Civil servants, of course, face pressure from many different sources, and it's up to individual civil servants whether they're able to cope with stress. I've heard that some civil servants may feel under pressure when faced with certain procedures or disciplinary action. Now, I started visiting departments since I took up my post, and we asked the management to find out more about the stress faced by their colleagues in their day-to-day duties. Maybe their relationship with their supervisors, or at work they encounter certain tough cases. We asked the management to pay particular attention to these circumstances, and if the procedures could be simplified in any way to help lessen the stress, well, I encourage the heads of departments to give due consideration to that. The clinical psychologist at the family's clinic. The service started in 2016. 900 counseling sessions were conducted, and by the end of April, 38 education activities have been staged. And now we are, the reference department is doing recruitment to add 2 more psychologists. We understand the recruitment exercise is almost completed. The aim is that by the end of this year, we will have 2 additional clinical psychologists to provide service to civil servants. Now, 2016, for telephone counseling sessions, 290 cases refer to work stress. Did you refer any of these cases to the Families Clinic? How many? Well, those are 2 different types of service. Telephone counseling service is one type. Now, calls are taken, and if the counselor sees the need or the colleague requests, then they can make an appointment for face-to-face counseling. And if the case is serious or there is need for the service of a clinical psychologist, yes, then the case could be referred to clinical psychologist. But for the clinical psychology service at the Families Clinic, the civil servant concerned has to go to the Families Clinic, see a doctor, and the government doctor may then refer him to the clinical psychologist. So those are 2 separate streams of service. Dr. N. Chen, 5 minutes.
其實
In the past few years, the civil service have faced a lot of pressure. There's a bigger population, and sometimes the public demand the right to information to everything. That made the civil servants being afraid of being complained. So back in June, I have a written inquiry to the former secretary of civil service, and which he replied. I was asking on the problem of voice recording, because some civil service complained that voice recording had been made and then submitted to disappear, and then to later criticize the civil service complaint. And the previous secretary replied that that having a voice recording of civil servants may be charged of a dishonest use of computer. Maybe it could be liable to 5 years imprisonment. That could assure the civil servants, so that because you could just simply inappropriate to record at the drop of the hat. So let's say I'm recording using your phone could be treated the same as it's on use a computer. However, how about on a video recording on smartphones? Because this so let me just raise inquiry. Maybe the secretary could reply later if you're not able to give me the answer on the spot. So I'm glad that you reminded that you were the permanent secretary for Security Bureau. But as you know, the most distress will come from the police were under huge amount of stress. The chairman, I have written to you that we need to discuss the civil servants being humiliated or issues arising. I'm grateful that you had put that in the matters arising, and hope that we could discuss it at back in October. I'm asking my colleague to edit the footage. So, but after I see that they pleaded with me not to put them on Facebook because they were quite disturbing to the viewers. I'm actually quite disturbed. All the foul language for the other secretary. You wouldn't have the heart to say any one of them. So I think that's a serious problem. So you mentioned all the counseling, all the services, and so on. So actually, a lot of matters have actually been penciled up. It could not be addressed by counseling alone. I think this shouldn't be occurring in the first place. the Hong Kong public had great respect for the civil service, and the civil service, as compared to a lot of countries in the world, is considered quite competent. However, in the past few years, have been under frequent criticism, and hope that the Secretary could address this, and hope that we could discuss this at the next term. And other Secretary could also consider that since you have 3 clinical psychologists compared to 160,000 CS ranks, could we need to have more clinical psychologists now that the stress level is ever increasing? I met some doctors who told me that the head department is requires unnecessary stress. However, I would raise this question. The doctors are quite under a lot of stress for overtime work and so forth. However, I would raise inquiry at the panel on medical services. I hope that there will be more clinical psychologists and counselors in place in helping the civil servants. And secondly, and for the and humiliating of civil servants, that could discuss at the next meeting whether we could do something. It reached the point that that my colleague responsible for editing the video urged me not to put it online. I can forward the video to you. To Secretary, any response? So let me answer 2 simple questions first. As for the video recording by smartphone, that would actually be a breach of the dishonest use of computers. As for the clinical psychologist, from a year ago we all have 1, and now that we have 2, there's actually a 200% increase. Of course, because you have a low basis to start with. In the past, it handled 900 cases. We expect that now that we have 2 more clinical psychologists every year, we're able to handle 1,500 cases, and depends on the issues. We would see we can add more clinical psychologists. So after we add 2 CP, we shall see how it goes. As for the insulting public officers, I know that the community is quite polarized on this issue. On one side thinks that legislation is necessary. Another side thinks that the legislation would further polarize the society, actually restrict the freedom of speech of the public. Regardless, at present, we do not see the need to establish such legislation, because the existing legislation to offer some protection for civil servants. For example, if they intimidate or initiate aggression against civil servants or disturb the public peace, this behavior could be prosecuted using existing legislation to take action. And like the previous secretary had mentioned, the former secretary for security have answered this question in LegCo. That will be listen to all of you carefully, and then we will look into we'll see what we should do in the future. And at the right time, this committee would like to discuss this. We're glad to be to take part in this. Thank you. So I also have a question. The secretary. For 2016, there's only 1 clinical psychologist, so we need to procure the services. So there's only 30 sessions. That was because of limited resources. Of course, you have these 490 telephone counseling sessions. However, for the services for 30 appointments, because they're quite expensive, so this led to such small number. However, this is all bygone. So let's just look ahead. We should look ahead. That of the 11 departments have their dedicated counseling services. So how effective are the counseling services provided there? Because we don't see any figures provided in the document. And coming up, we would have 2 more clinical psychologists. That makes 3 in total, which is a good thing. Of course, we need to evaluate, engage the demand. I must mention that Hong Kong do have a culture of complaints. However, this is no excuse. Some of them are legitimate, some of them probably out of jest or spite. So how should we handle this, and how should the department, do they have any guidelines? Let's say Mr. Poon had mentioned that maybe the complaint was unsubstantiated. It seemed to give them a lot of trouble asking him to sign documents or engage in extra work that make the colleague concerned quite uncomfortable. So how do we prevent recurrence of this kind of incidents to ensure our civil servants could have a healthy working environment and maintain the morale? Secretary? As for the clinical psychologists, so maybe I wasn't clear in some areas. The clinical psychologists in family clinics, and from 2016 till the end of April this year, had provided 900 appointments and 38 education activities. That is would have 2 more CPs at the end of this year. As for the telephone counseling service, in 2014 is about 305 users. However, the sessions is about 630. In 2015, 280, and the session, because some people use more than once, about 680 sessions. In 2016, 288 persons and the 487 sessions. That's the telephone counseling session. And in some situations, there are about 20 or 30 cases who had an appointment with a clinical psychologist. As for individual departments, so I can probably provide some information. So the department have their own dedicated counseling services. For the bigger departments, let's say the police force, the number of persons served, they actually have a CP in there is 602 in 2016, and 532 in 2015, and 616 in 2014. And in 2016 is 2,820, and 2,300, and so on, 2,800, so on. So it seems to quite a considerable number of sessions. So I'm not going to go into individual figures. As for the complaint handling of individual cases, so let me see it this way. Our complaint handling mechanism, on one hand, we have to facilitate public scrutiny of the government's work. And if there is dissatisfaction of the service provided government, the public had a right to complain. On the other hand, we have to make sure that our colleagues can address them effectively and in a timely manner. And where it gone wrong was that the complainants may not express the view in a rational manner, or the colleagues handling complaint might have room for improvement on their handling techniques. Through departmental training or workshops, we would hope to help the department to handle complaints and helping our colleagues to address them in a systematic manner, or to face their aggression or irrational behavior on how they should handle them. So we would step up on that. And on mechanism, I don't feel any major problems. However, in the future, if we think that we need to enhance the mechanism, I'll be glad to discuss with the relevant departments. Thank you, Secretary. Any members who would like to speak in the second round? We have Ms. Chang.
3 minutes, please. Mr. Chairman, last time we talked about the stress faced by civil servants. We held a public hearing. Many civil servants came and told us that they were under immense stress. So their spirit or their mental state, it's not that they're actually ill, but they feel, frustrated, and they want to see a doctor, but they're not allowed to see a Chinese doctor. But Western doctor would just say they have an emotion problem, they give them medicine, but that may not help. But sometimes if they just go to see a Chinese doctor, take some herbal medicine, and that might help. Now, last time I talked to your predecessor, he said he would look into that. Because in the past, you will not consider Chinese medicine service, or you don't allow them to claim for such service. It's because in the past, Chinese medicine was not at all recognized in the country. But now the government recognizes Chinese medicine doctors. Dr. Ko, his bureau gave now issued medical vouchers, and elderly persons are allowed to go and consult a Chinese doctor. They each get $2,000 in voucher amount. And then your predecessor agreed to look into that. I don't know what's the situation. Please follow up on that, because we want Chinese civil servants to be allowed to see Chinese doctor, because if they take some herbal tea, it may calm them down and they feel better. Well, I see a Chinese doctor too from time to time. But there's not a family's clinic at the moment that provides Chinese medicine service. Right now, the hospital authority provides a traditional Chinese medicine service. And after the former secretary for these civil servants talked to you, I don't have anything to update you on, Dr. Chiang. But I will go back and follow up on this. And when there's any news, we will come back and report to you. Thank you. Okay, then, Secretary, please take with you questions raised by members on Chinese medicine. Please follow up on that as soon as possible. Don't, because this is something you're working on, please don't miss out on the opportunity, especially with regard to the Chung Kang O Chinese Medicine Hospital. Item 5 on the agenda. This is the last meeting of this panel for the session. I would like to thank members again. I'd also like to thank all government officials for coming to our meetings and answering our questions. Is there anything else on the AOB? No? Then meeting adjourned. Thank you very much.